He led his elite cavalry unit on a routine patrol, feeling completely safe, surrounded by his own scouts. But what really happened to Captain Edmund Hentig on that fateful day? Today's story comes to us from Matt in Tucson, Arizona. He writes, "Dear author, my great-great-grandfather served at Fort Apache in 1881 and left behind strange diaries about a scout mutiny. Well, Matt, thank you so much for this excellent suggestion for our story. I can tell you that the reality of this story is far more terrifying than any army tall tale. Our story takes place in 1881 at the remote Fort Apache in Arizona. In those days, this sun-scorched land showed absolutely no mercy to inexperienced settlers. It was generally agreed that service on this dusty frontier demanded incredible physical endurance from the soldiers. The heat here reached 120 degrees, turning the blue uniform into a veritable oven for any man. People had little time for long conversations or philosophical musings under such a scorching sun. Their lives consisted of endless patrols, cleaning their weapons, and trying to escape the ever-present red dust. Captain Edmund Hentig was an experienced officer who had devoted the best years of his youth to the cavalry. He was respected by both the rank-and-file soldiers and the stern fort commander, Colonel Eugene Carr. Edmund lived in a small wooden house on the garrison grounds with his devoted wife. In the evenings, they had salted pork and canned peaches for dinner, washing it down with murky, warm coffee. For them, buying a new calico dress from a passing merchant was a huge and rare treat. The Hentig home was lit by dim tallow candles, the smell of which permanently permeated their clothes and hair. On the shelves stood carved wooden horse figurines that the captain had made for the neighborhood children. Today, it is hard for us to imagine a world where delivering a simple letter from home took several long months. Soldiers slept on hard, creaky cots, constantly shaking poisonous scorpions out of their heavy marching boots. Every morning invariably began with the hoarse sound of a bugle and roll call on the parade ground under the scorching sun. The security of Fort Apache depended almost entirely on a detachment of scouts recruited from local Native American tribes. These scouts from the White Mountain tribe knew every rock and secret trail in the area like the back of their hands. Colonel Carr trusted these men unconditionally, equipping them with modern army rifles and generous pay. The scouts wore blue army jackets over their traditional loincloths, creating a unique frontier look. Their leader was a charismatic and highly intelligent Native American named Dandy Jim, who spoke excellent English. No one at the fort even suspected what dark thoughts were lurking in the minds of these trusted guides. By the end of the sweltering summer, alarming rumors of a new Indian prophet began to reach the fort. A shaman named Noke Del Clean began gathering huge crowds of followers in the remote Sibiku Creek Valley. He held strange nighttime dances, boldly promising to resurrect dead chiefs and drive the white people away forever. Rumors spread the news of these mystical and terrifying rituals throughout all the neighboring settlements. Local farmers began hastily barricading their homes, terrified of the start of a new bloody Indian war. Authorities in Washington demanded the shaman's immediate arrest to prevent a possible large-scale uprising of all the tribes. Colonel Carr received a direct, unalterable order to advance into the valley and bring the prophet straight to the fort. He assembled a powerful detachment of 60 cavalrymen and 23 Native American scouts for this important mission. Captain Hentig rode at the head of the column, absolutely confident of a swift and peaceful resolution to the conflict. They took with them a very meager supply of provisions, expecting to return home in just a few days. To all involved, this patrol seemed like a perfectly ordinary army outing through the long familiar dusty canyons. The detachment safely crossed the deep gorges and reached the shaman's camp at noon on August 29th. To everyone's surprise, Noke Del Clean took the news of his arrest calmly and voluntarily agreed to go to the fort the following morning. The soldiers set up camp on the banks of the Sibiku Creek, feeling immense relief at such a peaceful, bloodless outcome. The campfires crackled merrily in the twilight, while the weary cavalrymen cooked their simple army dinner of beans. I believe that this evening's rest stop seemed to absolutely everyone involved to be a completely safe end to a long, exhausting journey. On the morning of August 30th, the detachment began to slowly move back toward their home fort, Fort Apache. The captured Sharman rode his horse, closely surrounded by an armed escort of the most experienced American soldiers. However, a huge crowd of Indians began to close in around Colonel Carr's moving cavalry column in a tight ring. The faces of the locals were heavily painted with war paint, and brand new rifles gleamed menacingly in their tense hands. The scout patrols, who were supposed to protect the soldiers according to regulations, suddenly and in an organized manner defected to the side of the enraged crowd. The tension in the scorching morning air reached its absolute and utterly unbearable breaking point. Captain Hentig was the first to notice that Dandy Jim had begun coolly loading his rifle with live ammunition. The officer tried to calm the Indians, loudly ordering them to move back to a safe distance from the arrested Sharman. He raised his empty hand high to signal his peaceful intentions and halt the impending mass bloodshed. At that very moment, the morning silence of the wild valley was shattered by a deafening volley of gunfire. The peace of the American Southwest was changed forever in a single, interminably long second.
What is it?
On August 30th, 1881, Indian scouts were the first to open fire on their commanders. Captain Hentig didn't even have time to draw his revolver before he was fatally wounded, shot squarely in the chest. He fell heavily from his horse onto the dry, rocky ground, staining the hot dust with his blood. And while Colonel Carr watched this unfold, his own trusted scouts methodically mowed down the stunned American soldiers. Private John Sullivan tried to drag the captain's body out from under the heavy fire, but was himself struck by a bullet. The entire cavalry squadron found itself in a perfect death trap on the narrow bank of a shallow mountain stream. "Hold your formation, boys. Don't let them flank us," Colonel Carr shouted desperately. Private Sullivan, clutching the gaping wound on his shoulder, replied hoarsely, "Sir, the scouts are firing directly at our positions." Carr drew his heavy saber and ordered, "We're retreating to the high hill. Conserve your ammunition for precise fire." The cavalrymen dismounted and began an orderly retreat toward the high ground, firing continuously at the vastly superior enemy forces. The air was instantly filled with acrid gunpowder smoke, the blood-curdling screams of the wounded, and the wild howls of the Indian warriors. During this chaotic and merciless firefight, one of the sergeants shot the captured prophet, Noke Del Klin. The Sharman fell dead, which sparked even greater, uncontrollable fury among his numerous fanatical followers. The Indians advanced in dense waves, paying no attention whatsoever to the accurate return fire from the American cavalrymen. The besieged soldiers used the carcasses of their slain horses as makeshift breastworks to shield themselves from the hail of bullets. The unbearable heat intensified their thirst, but the life-saving stream was now under the complete control of the skilled Indian marksmen. By sunset on that dreadful day, the cavalry detachment had suffered truly catastrophic and irreparable human losses. Captain Hentig's unit had been virtually wiped out in the very first minutes of this treacherous mutiny. The bodies of slain soldiers lay everywhere, the same men who had been joking carefree around the campfire that early morning. The surviving soldiers lay silently in the dust all night, listening to the eerie victory songs of the Apaches in the dark valley. Carr knew full well that by morning they would have completely run out of ammunition and all their drinking water. Rescue seemed utterly impossible, but under the cover of pitch darkness, the remnants of the detachment miraculously managed to slip away quietly. Exhausted and wounded, the soldiers made their way to Fort Apache over several long and incredibly arduous days. They had abandoned all their equipment, carrying only their severely wounded comrades in arms on their backs. When they finally appeared on the horizon, the sentries on the fort's walls simply could not believe their eyes. Instead of a proud, gleaming cavalry, emaciated ghosts emerged from the desert, completely covered in caked blood and mud. Hysteria and panic immediately broke out in the garrison, for exactly half of the detachment had been left lying in the canyon. But the tragedy was only just beginning, as the enraged Apaches decided not to rest on their bloody success. On September 2nd, they suddenly attacked a small detachment of army signalmen who were repairing a damaged telegraph line. Sergeant Stewart and his men were repairing the severed wires just a few miles from the fort's main gate. They were killed instantly, without even having time to realize where the deadly arrows and bullets had come from. Thus, a second American unit was completely and mercilessly destroyed in a single short and bloody week. Fort Apache found itself completely cut off from the outside world and deprived of any possibility of calling for rescue reinforcements. The third devastating blow followed immediately, striking the slow-moving army supply train carrying provisions and ammunition. A small escort detachment, accompanying the heavy wagons from Tucson, fell into a well-organized Indian ambush. The Apaches burned all the wagons, seized the brand-new rifles, and dealt with the soldiers guarding the cargo with extreme brutality. Thus, in a matter of days, the US Army lost 3 full combat units at once in a single area. It was a completely unprecedented and shameful failure that deeply shocked even the most experienced veterans of the frontier. On September 1st, emboldened by their success, the rebels dared to do something they had never done before in these parts. They opened massive, targeted fire directly at the wooden buildings of Fort Apache itself from the neighboring hills. The officers' wives hid in terror in dark cellars, covering the ears of their children who were crying in fear. Whistling bullets pierced the wooden roofs, shattered the windows to pieces, and lodged deep into the thick log walls of the barracks. The fort's defenders fired blindly, desperately trying to drive the invisible enemy away from their fragile and vulnerable homes. The siege lasted several long hours, turning the settlers' lives into a veritable, endless nightmare. The eyes of the exhausted surviving soldiers saw only rising dust and bright flashes of gunfire on distant cliffs. The constant, deafening roar of large-caliber army rifles and defensive cannons rang incessantly in their ears. The air was thick with the smell of hot copper, acrid burnt gunpowder, and dry earth scorched by the midday sun. Every man understood clearly that the next stray bullet could easily be his last. This primal terror completely paralyzed the garrison, forcing the men to pray earnestly for the swift arrival of the saving darkness. When the endless firing finally subsided, an ominous and incredibly heavy silence hung over the ravaged desert. The Apaches vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, as if dissolving into the scorching haze of the hot air. For a long time, the soldiers were afraid to leave their secure shelters, expecting a new, even more terrifying wave of attack. Colonel Carr surveyed the destruction gloomily, realizing the full, irreversible depth of the catastrophe that had befallen his loyal men. In just a few days, his once exemplary garrison had turned into a besieged and blood-soaked camp. In the first days after the massacre, the people in the fort were in a state of profound shock. Soldiers wandered silently through the courtyard, gathering the bodies of their slain comrades for a mass burial. Women tore their old dresses into bandages, trying to save the severely wounded defenders. No one could believe that their own scouts had committed such a treacherous betrayal. Yesterday's friends, with whom they had shared tobacco and food, had become their most terrifying enemies. Fear permeated every wooden plank in this military settlement cut off from civilization. Rumors spread the news of the tragedy far beyond Fort Apache. Settlers in the neighboring valleys began abandoning their farms en masse and fleeing to the major cities. Farmers left their harvested crops behind, drove off their livestock, and took only the bare necessities for survival. The roads were filled with frightened refugees who looked fearfully at every suspicious shadow in the bushes. None of these people felt safe anymore in these once peaceful lands. A full-blown panic broke out in Tucson when the first exhausted couriers arrived with the news. Newspapers, such as the *Tucson Citizen*, ran huge black headlines about the destruction of the Carr garrison. Rumors exaggerated the scale of the tragedy, claiming that the Indians had slaughtered absolutely every white settler in Arizona. Local militias began arming themselves in a hurry, preparing to repel a full-scale invasion by the united hostile tribes. State authorities sent desperate telegrams to Washington, begging for regular troops to be sent immediately for protection. The entire American Southwest found itself on the brink of the bloodiest and largest war in its history. The official response from the US War Department was lightning fast and incredibly harsh in its scale. Thousands of experienced soldiers were urgently deployed to Arizona from other, more peaceful states across the country. General Wilcox took command of the punitive operation to search for and completely destroy the rebels. The government offered a huge cash reward for the capture of Dandy Jim and other leaders of the Indian uprising. Military tribunals began hastily preparing documents for a show trial of all participants in this bloodshed. The army began methodically combing the mountains, employing the latest combat tactics for complex rocky terrain. Soldiers mercilessly burned the crops of the rebellious tribes, forcing them to retreat ever higher into the cold, snow-covered mountain passes. It was a brutal war of attrition, where there was absolutely no room for mercy or lengthy negotiations. Each side understood perfectly well that the loser would forever lose the historical right to live on this harsh land. The soldiers' survival in such extreme conditions depended entirely on the quality of their training and the reliability of their camping gear. Give the person you truly love peace of mind and safety with a professional kit from Frontier Gear. This compact hiking backpack contains absolutely everything needed for the most extreme and unforeseen situations. It includes a reliable fire starter, a first aid kit, and a special thermal blanket that can save a person in any harsh weather. Just click the link in the description below to get a great discount for our loyal viewers. And now, let's quickly return to our gripping story and find out the outcome of this brutal confrontation. While fierce battles raged, very strange and completely inexplicable additional events began to occur around the fort. At night, exhausted sentries often heard the muffled beats of Indian drums echoing from the empty, dark canyons. Some soldiers swore on their lives that they clearly saw the ghostly figure of the slain shaman silently wandering along the stream bed. Army horses in their stalls would suddenly panic and break their sturdy ties for no apparent reason. These eerie, mystical phenomena seriously undermined the morale of even the most hardened and battle-hardened veterans. Fear of the unknown and the supernatural terrified these brave men far more than the very real enemy bullets. The pace of the army's punitive operation grew relentlessly with each new week of uncompromising and bloody pursuit. The cavalry systematically drove the rebels into narrow gorges, ruthlessly cutting off their access to fresh drinking water. The Apaches resisted with the true desperation of doomed men, setting up cunning, deadly ambushes on the winding mountain passes. The commander's proposals grew shorter and shorter. Orders became harsher, and the general tension at headquarters grew daily. None of the officers wanted to repeat the tragic fate of Captain Hentig and his unfortunate, annihilated detachment. By the end of the cold autumn, the army's encirclement had finally closed in on the starved Native American rebels. Dandy Jim and several other key leaders of the bloody uprising were forced to officially surrender to the American authorities. They were immediately shackled in heavy iron chains and sent under heavy guard to a strict military prison. The soldiers of Fort Apache stood silently in line along the dusty road, watching their former comrades depart with heavy hearts. In their weary eyes, one could see a profound incomprehension of how such a monstrous and senseless tragedy could have happened at all. An embittered American public demanded that the judges impose immediate and the harshest possible punishment for the blood of their fellow citizens that had been shed. The trial of the former Indian scouts became one of the most high-profile and sensational trials of that harsh era. Renowned journalists from across the vast country flocked to the city to provide detailed coverage of these dramatic court proceedings. Prosecutors categorically demanded the death penalty by hanging for absolutely all, without exception, of the instigators of this military mutiny. The hired defense attorneys desperately tried to prove to the jury that the Native Americans were simply instinctively defending their spiritual leader from an unlawful armed arrest. However, the true and deeply hidden causes of this unprecedented military mutiny turned out to be far more complex than they appeared at first glance. And so, the debate continued for many long and agonizing years after that fateful and bloody September. Ordinary people and prominent scholars constantly put forward a wide variety of bold theories about the causes of this sudden uprising. The first popular theory held that it was a large-scale and incredibly meticulously planned conspiracy by all the scattered Apache tribes. Convinced supporters of this idea sincerely believed that a cunning shaman had deliberately lured the naive Colonel Carr into a deadly mountain trap. They seriously believed that the Indians had been secretly hoarding stolen army weapons for years, solely for this single, decisive and crushing blow. A second, widely held theory placed the entire blame solely on the flagrant incompetence of Colonel Eugene Carr himself. Harsh critics claimed that he had acted with criminal negligence by sending armed Indians to arrest their own revered prophet. In their firm opinion, the high-ranking officer was too overconfident and simply ignored the obvious signs of an impending armed uprising. Newspapers in the capital directly accused the commander of cold-bloodedly sacrificing the lives of his loyal men for the sake of dubious personal glory. Many influential politicians openly demanded that he be stripped of his military rank in disgrace and immediately brought before a strict military tribunal. This scandalous version was discussed with the utmost intensity and passion for a long time in the highest officer circles of distant Washington. The third well-known theory had a distinctly mystical and even frankly frightening supernatural character. Frightened locals whispered in taverns that No-Kidel Cleen truly possessed ancient, powerful magic and a terrifying hypnotic gift. They firmly believed that the sorcerer had literally enslaved the minds of the poor scouts, physically forcing them to shoot their kind white commanders. Some surviving cavalrymen testified under oath that the eyes of the attacking scouts on that dreadful day were completely empty and black. This truly eerie legend still circulates regularly among the old, grey-haired cowboys around the crackling campfires of sweltering Arizona. This dense, impenetrable tangle of absurd rumors and sensational newspaper headlines reliably concealed the true state of affairs. Each of the theories put forward invariably had its devoted supporters, ready to argue until they were hoarse in the smoke-filled local bars. For a long time, it seemed that the true motives behind Dandy Jim's terrible betrayal had been carried away forever by the merciless, dry wind of the Great Desert. For decades, armchair historians fiercely debated what had served as the real catalyst for this senseless bloodbath. But if you really want to know the truth, you'll have to take a close look at the classified army archives from that turbulent time. The key to the mystery lies in the official reports, yellowed with age, which the High Command desperately tried to hide from the general public forever. The shocking truth was that the scouts had warned their commanders in advance and on multiple occasions of the impending, inevitable disaster, but not because they suddenly wanted to cruelly betray the American army and kill their comrades in arms, but because they were sincerely and desperately trying to save both sides from a completely senseless and extremely brutal mass bloodbath. Dandy Jim personally came to Colonel Carr's office a full week before the tragedy, tearfully begging him to cancel this provocative arrest. He explained in detail that the old shaman possessed absolute and unquestionable spiritual authority, and that his public humiliation would provoke an uncontrollable social explosion. However, the Army Command in distant Washington arrogantly and prejudicially ignored these desperate pleas from its most loyal and experienced scouts. The haughty generals directly threatened the scouts with prison and disgrace if they dared to refuse to participate in the expedition to the Sibiku Valley. The unfortunate Indians found themselves trapped in an utterly impossible situation, cruelly caught between their official military duty and the sacred beliefs of their people. When the first chaotic gunfire broke out and the revered shaman was killed by a stray bullet, these people, already stretched to the limit, simply lost their nerve. This was by no means a cunningly planned conspiracy, but merely a spontaneous and terrible outburst of despair from people driven into a corner. The incompetent army itself, with its own hands, literally forced its best soldiers to pull the trigger on that fateful August day. In the cold month of March 1882, the three main ringleaders of this spontaneous mutiny were publicly and demonstratively hanged. The proud Dandy Jim stoically accepted his death with his head held high, never uttering a single word of remorse or fear. Colonel Carr formally retained his high command, but the heavy shadow of that terrible catastrophe haunted him relentlessly until the end of his days. The brave Captain Edmund Hentig remained forever buried in an unmarked, dusty grave somewhere in the endless wild canyons of Arizona. The ruthless state system dryly and cruelly crushed the fates of absolutely all participants in those terrible historical events, sparing absolutely no one. This forgotten historical drama forces us to reflect very seriously on the incredibly high price of a general's arrogance and blind obedience to others' orders. How often in our modern lives do we thoughtlessly ignore the warnings of wise people, relying solely on brute force and formal authority? Could we have acted differently had we suddenly found ourselves in the place of those desperate and cornered Native American Army scouts? Is it possible that someone watching us right now knows the answer to this incredibly complex and painful moral dilemma of the past? Perhaps in the old dusty trunks of Arizona's indigenous people, there still lie unknown diaries capable of shedding even more light on these events. This bloody mystery of the Wild West continues to deeply stir the minds of researchers and ordinary enthusiasts, even after more than 100 long years. There you have it, my friends. Now you know the full story of the brave Captain Hentig and the forgotten mutiny at Cibecue Creek. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to our viewer Matt from Tucson for generously sharing this amazing local family legend. Be sure to send your own unique historical finds and stories to me via email, because I take great pleasure in reading every single one of your messages. Thank you for watching. Our humble history channel exists and thrives only thanks to your constant support and sincere interest in America's past. I really hope this challenging story has helped you understand a little better the harsh realities of life on the dangerous frontier of civilization. Never forget to share your thoughts in the comments below the video, because I'm always incredibly interested in hearing your honest, personal opinion. Be sure to take care of yourselves and your loved ones in these modern, very challenging, and rapidly changing times. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to get more true stories from the bloody and glorious history of the American frontier.